All right, today we're going to be talking about the Middle Passage, the portion of triangular trade in which people were kidnapped and enslaved and transported across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to the Americas. But in reality, I'm not telling you about this so much as this man is Olata Equiano. Olata Equiano was an African who was born in Africa, enslaved, and transported to the Americas through the Middle Passage, and he writes an account or a story of what he experiences. So, the triangular trade by Olata Equiano today. So, the story that you will read, I'm going to read it out loud. I want you to follow along with the slides as we go. It was written by a man named Olata Equiano. As a child, he was kidnapped from Africa and sold into slavery. There is no better way for you to learn about the horrors of the Middle Passage than to hear about it from someone who lived it. I could tell you stories, I could spend time trying to make you understand how awful it was, but in reality, Olata Equiano will do a much better job. So follow along as we read. This is a Nearpod, so it will be interrupted with questions as we go. Let's get started. Again, this is Olata Equiano. My father, besides many slaves, had a numerous family. I was trained up from my earliest years in the art of war. My daily exercise was shooting and throwing javelins, and my mother adorned me with emblems after the manner of our greatest warriors. In this way I grew up till I had turned the age of 11, when an end was put to my happiness in the following manner. Generally, when the grown people in the neighborhood were gone far in the fields to labor, the children assembled together in some of the neighboring premises or areas to play. Commonly, some of us used to go up a tree to look out for any kidnapper that might come upon us, for they sometimes took those opportunities of our parents' absence to attack and carry off as many as they could seize. One day, as I was watching at the top of a tree in our yard, I saw one of those people come into the yard and our next neighbor to kidnap many stout young people in it. Immediately on this, I gave the alarm of the rogue, and he was surrounded by the stoutest of them, who entangled him with ropes or cords, so that he could not escape, till some of the grown people came and secured him. But soon it was my fate to be thus attacked and to be carried off when none of the grown people were around. So what I want you to pay attention to in this first opening section of his story, what has Equiano just explained to us is common. What happens all the time in this community? So often that every time the adults go away, the children know that one of them needs to be in a tree looking out for kidnappers. This was common. One day, when all of our people were gone out to their work as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, two men and a woman got over our walls and in a moment seized us both. And without giving us time to cry out or make resistance, they stopped our mouths and dragged us into the nearest wood. Here they tied our hands and continued to carry us as far as they could till night came on, when we reached a small house where the robbers halted for refreshment and spent the night. The next morning, we left the house and continued traveling all the day. For a long time we had kept to the woods, but at last we came to a road which I believed I knew. I had now some hopes of being delivered, for we had advanced but a little way before I discovered some people at a distance, on which I began to cry out for their assistance. But my cries had no other effect than to make them tie me faster and stop my mouth, and then they put me into a large sack. Thus I continued to travel, sometimes by land and sometimes by water, through different countries and various nations, till at the end of 6 or 7 months after I had been kidnapped, I arrived at the seacoast. The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea, and a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor, waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. I was now convinced that they were going to kill me. Their complexions, or their skin color, too, different so much from ours, their long hair, and the language they spoke, which was very different from any that I had ever heard, united to confirm me in this belief. When I looked round the ship and saw a large furnace of copper boiling, and a multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of their faces expressing dejection and sorrow, I no longer doubted of my fate, and quite overpowered with horror and anguish, I fell motionless on the deck and I fainted. When I recovered a little, I found some black people about me who I believed were some of those who had brought me on board and had been receiving their pay. They talked to me in order to cheer me, but all in vain. I asked them if we were not to be eaten by those white men with horrible looks, red faces, and long hair. They told me I was not. Soon after this, the blacks who had brought me on board went off and left me abandoned to despair. I now wished for my former slavery in preference to my present situation, which was filled with horrors of every kind, still heightened and made worse by my ignorance of what I was to undergo. I was soon put down under the decks inside the ship, and there I received such a stench in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life. So that with the horror of the stench and the crying all together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me. But soon, to my grief, 2 of the white men offered me eatables or food, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands, tied my feet, while the other flogged me severely. I had never experienced anything of this kind before, and although not being used to the water, I naturally feared it the first time I saw it. Yet, nevertheless, if I could have got over the nettings, over the side of the ship, I would have jumped over. But I could not. And besides, the crew used to watch us very closely who were not chained down to the decks, lest we should leap into the water. And I have seen some of these poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so, and hourly whipped for not eating. In a little time after, amongst the poor chained men, I found some of my own nation, which in a small degree gave ease to my mind. I asked or inquired of these what was to be done with us. They told me we were to be carried to these white people's country to work for them. I then was a little revived and relieved, and thought, if it were no worse than working, my situation was not so desperate. But still I feared I should be put to death. The white people looked and acted, as I thought, in so savage a manner. For I had never seen among any people such instances of brutal cruelty, and this not only shown towards us blacks, but also to some of the whites themselves. One white man in particular I saw, when we were permitted to be on deck, flogged so unmercifully with a large rope near the foremast, that he died in consequence of it, and they tossed him over the side as they would have done a brute. This made me fear these people the more, and I expected nothing less than to be treated in the same manner. While we stayed on the coast, I was mostly on deck. Later, we were all put under the deck so that we could not see how they managed the vessel. Now, real quick, they did that to make sure that nobody would attack the sailors, because if they knew how to sail the ship, then they knew the people who were enslaved might try and take over. Okay, catching back up. The stench of the hold, or the space inside the ship, while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time, and some of us had been permitted to stay on the deck for the fresh air. But now that the whole ship's cargo was confined together, it became absolutely pestilential. It was covered with disease. You could smell it. You could taste it. You could feel it. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number of people in the ship, which was so crowded that each person had barely room to turn himself over, almost suffocated us. This produced so much sweat, so that the air soon became unfit for breathing from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died. At this point, they would have arrived in the Americas. Olada, Equiano, and the other enslaved people on the boat would have been unloaded, and they would have been sold to people in the Americas to use as enslaved labor. Answer the rest of the questions. Good luck.